2018, and Linda and my sister Sue and myself decided we were going to do a 6-week trip to New Zealand, and we all had our various options. And I said, well, look, why don't we just spend the last 5 days quietly somewhere in the north of New Zealand and recover after having done the thing. So that was agreed, and I said, well, let's go to the Bay of Islands, and which is on the north of New Zealand, and I can go then diving 2 wrecks. One is the Rainbow Warrior, and the other one is the New Zealand frigate Canterbury, is the sister ship of HMS Scylla, which I'll talk about in about 3 weeks' time. So we booked 3 weeks of diving, and one of the dives I did was the wreck of the Rainbow Warrior. And those of you who know the wreck will know that it's got a fascinating history over time, and that history has evolved. So those of us who are around and old enough to remember it will find this probably quite an interesting tale. So the Rainbow Warrior then, a tale of nuclear bombs, eco-warriors, spies, sabotage, and tragedy. I'll start off by, where is the Rainbow Warrior? It's in New Zealand, which we can see there. And within New Zealand, we've got the North Island, and on the green bit here, you can see what's the very north of the island. And there you can see the Bay of Islands, which is where we were based. And as I say, the Rainbow Warrior was sunk twice. Firstly, it was sunk there down in Auckland Harbour, and then later it was sunk up here in the Cavalli Islands. And how it came to be sunk twice is what the tale's all about, and I'll also what it looks like nowadays. So, and the story turns out to be a little bit of a spy thriller. Looking at the history of the Rainbow Warrior, then the Rainbow Warrior was built in 1955, and she was ordered by the MAF, the UK Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, as a trawler, which was kitted out as a research ship and was called Sir William Hardy, and it's named after some Scottish food scientist. Length was about 39 meters, and gross tonnage is 418 tons. And just for comparison, the Elk is 33 meters long, but only weighs about a quarter of that. And then you can see a picture of the ship in its original looks. It was then sold to Greenpeace, who then did a refit. The refit that they did on the boat, actually, as we shall see later, wasn't as good as perhaps it could have been. And that's how the Rainbow Warrior looked after they'd done the refit. And a bit later, to give it greater green credentials, they fitted some masts and turned it out, the catch rig, so that it could sail as well as use its motor. And for those of you who like interesting facts, it was the first, I think it was electric diesel ship ever built in the UK. So history of the Rainbow Warrior then, those of you who can remember, there was an awful lot of campaigning going on back in the 1970s and 1980s, and the Rainbow Warrior was very much involved in those campaigns. You look in the bottom right hand corner there, the United Kingdom used to put all its radioactive waste into barrels, take it out into the ocean, and then dump it. And that's quite a famous picture, because shortly after that they managed to, deliberately or otherwise, roll the barrows onto the Greenpeace boat that was trying to prevent them from being dumped. Luckily no one was injured. There used to be, back in the 1980s, a cull every year of the grey seals around the Isles of Orkney. It was decided that they were having a very negative impact on fish stocks, and the fisheries people were persuaded that 10 to 15% of the seals, grey seals around Orkney, had to be culled, and the Norwegians would turn up and duly do the job. But Greenpeace and others stopped all that. There is then, of course, the very famous Canadian seal pup harvest, which I think appalled everybody. And I think we can all remember seeing pictures of seal pups being clubbed to death with either pickaxes or clubs or whatever, and then sort of dragged unceremoniously across the ice to the ships and so on. And also Greenpeace was protesting against the dumping of toxic waste barrels in the sea. And top right hand side there, that's one of the very last whaling ships that the Spanish had, and you can see there it's being protected by the Spanish Navy. Greenpeace did at one stage get arrested. They were taken to a port. The Spanish moved components of the engine to prevent it being used again, but there's a story of how Greenpeace then smuggled the engine parts in, refitted them, and then did a midnight runner, which resulted in the head of the Spanish Navy losing its job. So it's got quite a checkered history. And perhaps the most thing that we know about is the campaign it did against the use of the South Pacific for nuclear testing. In 1963, the main nuclear powers, the Soviet Union as it was, the US and the UK, all signed a test ban treaty which banned the atmospheric, underwater and space testing, but no, not underground. However, the French, who had their own independent nuclear force, still wanted to carry on testing their nuclear weapons. So although everybody else stopped in 1963, the French carried on. And whoops, coming up, there it is. See in the bottom corner there that the testing they did was at Mururoa Atoll, which is in French Polynesia. And the photo actually shows one of the atmospheric tests that they conducted, which was quite a famous photo at the time. A couple points of note there. We've got New Caledonia, which is another French colony. That will appear later in the tale. And between New Caledonia and New Zealand, just off here, is an island called Norfolk Island, which will again feature in our tale. And the French, from 1966 to 1996, carried out about 193 nuclear tests. And Greenpeace, in collusion with the New Zealand government, was asked to use Rainbow Warrior to act as a base ship for a flotilla that was going to go out to Mururoa Atoll and essentially crash the exclusion zone and therefore prevent the French from carrying out their tests. And prior to that, there had been many other attempts to do that, and there were quite a lot of very, famously documented punch-ups between the French military and Greenpeace ships that were trying to break into the exclusion zone. And the bottom line is that French got very, very pissed off about the whole thing. But as part of its testing campaign, that's the crew of the Rainbow Warrior at the time of its first sinking. And one of the things that they did do was go to the Marshall Islands, which had been used by the US for nuclear testing. And what the Americans had done is taken the islanders off the islands, particularly one called Rongal Atoll, done their testing, said the island was safe, and put the islanders back. But of course, quite soon after that, lots of them started getting all sorts of diseases and cancers and so on. Very obvious that the island was contaminated. So Greenpeace basically went to Ireland, picked up islanders, as you can see in the three pictures at the bottom, and then relocated them elsewhere. And of course, that didn't go down terribly well with the Americans. The French were going to have a season of nuclear testing in 1985, and the Rainbow Warrior then travelled on to New Zealand to act as a base ship for a fleet of yachts that were going to sail to Mururoa Atoll and prevent the nuclear tests. And the upshot of it is that the protests had caused quite a few politically damaging protests over time. So the French decided that they were going to stop the Rainbow Warrior. Now the French have an agency called the DGSE, which is the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, otherwise known as the French CIA. And they have various divisions within the DGSE, and one is the Division Action, which is basically their black ops people, and they were ordered to stop the Rainbow Warrior. And it turned out later in time that the then French President Francois Mitterrand knew all about it and was believed to have authorized it. So the operation was on, and with a sense of the dramatic, the French called it Opération Satanique, and various things then happened, which I will tell you about. The first thing that happened was the need to find out about what the Rainbow Warrior and Greenpeace were up to. And in April the 23rd, was July, wasn't it? Something like that. And on April the 23rd, a French lady called Frédérique Bonlieu arrived in New Zealand and offered her services to the Greenpeace office. And they weren't suspicious of her because she had a friend who had a contact and they knew she was coming. But she actually turned out to be a DGSE intelligence officer, Lieutenant Christine Cabon. And the two pictures there show her as she was at the time. And the second one is a picture of her taken quite recently. And she was tracked down by, it was one of the New Zealand papers, and asked about, well, what did you think about what you did? And essentially her attitude was, well, I just did what I was asked to do. Je ne regrette rien, as they say. So she gets her job with Greenpeace, and basically she's gathering lots of intelligence about the plans have for Rainbow Warrior, most importantly where the ship's going to be berthed when it comes. And she also got a lot of information, the surrounding area for the rest of the. And then whether she left early because the job was done, or whether she was trying to avoid suspicion, she left New Zealand on May the 24th, and that's the end of her part in it. But essentially, the DGSE Action Division now have the information that they need. So the next step in the operation was actually getting the equipment that the sabotage team needed to New Zealand. Obviously, they couldn't sort of be overt about this. So we have Team 1, which was the crew of the yacht Aya. And the crew is quite interesting. These are three of the crew. You've got Chief Petty Officer Roland Verge, Petty Officer Gérald Andry, Petty Officer Jean-Michel Bartalo. They're all combat divers. They've been trained in underwater sabotage using rebreathers, and they will eventually travel to New Zealand using false identities. Attached to them is another Frenchman, Xavier Maniguet. He's a French naval officer, and he's also a doctor. He's also seconded to the DGSE, and it's thought that he was there because by some quaint rules they needed to have an officer in charge of the boat, but no one's quite sure what his role was. Anyhow, Verge travels to Nouméa in French Caledonia, and he charters the yacht, the Uvea, which you can see in the picture there. And that will be used to transport all the various bits and pieces that the team will need. In the meantime, Gérald Andrys goes off to London, and being a good Frenchman, he purchases a Zodiac dinghy and a Yamaha outboard from Barnet Marine in Surrey. They all then basically travel to Nouméa in French Caledonia, and then they meet up with another character who's a bit shady, and that's Lieutenant Colonel Louis-Pierre Dillet, and it's thought that he was the overall operation commander and basically directed the attack team. And once the team was all assembled, the yacht then sailed for New Zealand and arrived in New Zealand on the 22nd of June, arrived at a small port in the north of New Zealand. So the next thing is that kit's there, they know where they're going. There was a need for a reconnaissance and support team, and that was provided on the 22nd of June, the day that the Uvea arrived in New Zealand. A supposedly newlywed Swiss couple, Sophie and Alain Pourange, arrived in New Zealand, and apparently on their honeymoon. However, they were in fact undercover agents. She was Capitaine Dominique Prieur, and he was Major Alain Marfay. And the passports they were travelling on, I got from the New Zealand police statements, shows that the passports were actually expert forgeries. And Marfat was also a French Special Forces combat diver and had trained in the same place as the other members of the team. Prieur is in the DGSE intelligence section, and she was actually Christine Gabon, the lady who posed to get into the Greenpeace office. She was actually her controller. And their job is to provide the support that the attack team needed. And essentially, they hired this van from a hire company called Newman's in Auckland, and they then used the van. They travelled to a town called Parakai, met up with the team from the yacht, and picked up all the equipment that they needed. So we're now ready for the next part of the operation, and that is the attack team. Now, the attack team had as their leader Lieutenant Colonel Dillay, who we've met already, and he at the time was a senior officer at the Underwater Combat Centre school, if you like, based in Aspreto in Corsica, and he arrived the day after the reconnaissance team. The underwater team, the ones who actually carried out the attack, again, they arrived in New Zealand using assumed identities. They pretended that they were PE instructors from a girls' school in another French Polynesian island called Papeete. And this is Jean-Luc Kister and Jean Camas, and they are both trained combat divers. There's also a third person, a fourth person involved, and that is someone called Gerard Royal. Now, not a lot is known about him, and his role was unclear, but most of the sources I've looked at basically said that he was the driver of the inflatable that Kister and Camas used to travel across Auckland Harbour to get to the Rainbow Warrior. What's quite interesting about him is that his sister was actually a very senior government minister, and until a few years ago she was number 3 in the French government. He denies anything when asked. And they've now got the equipment and explosives collected from team number 2. So July the 10th, 1985 is the day, and what we see is on board the Rainbow Warrior, Steve Sawyer, who's the overall coordinator of the voyage that's about to take place, that the Rainbow Warrior is going to lead. He has a birthday party, and they celebrate that, not too wildly, sort of, cake and what have you. And also all the skippers of the fleet of boats that's going to join with the Rainbow Warrior meet up and go below decks with Peter Wilcox, who's the skipper of the Rainbow Warrior, and they discuss what their plans are. And a bit later, once the party is over, they leave the ship. A strange event takes place at that time, because the ship is then visited by a Frenchman called Francois Verlet. He comes on board, makes all sorts of noises, sounds like he's a very supportive person of Greenpeace and so on, asks a few questions. He's actually carrying out a last-minute reconnaissance just to see exactly how the land lies. They didn't suspect him at all, although they did think that his very smart dress looked a bit out of keeping with the usual sort of Greenpeace type of supporter, and he also seemed to know very, very little about any French organisations. He then tips off the team and the attack goes underway. And then around about 8:30, the attack team is brought across the harbour in the inflatable, and Kister and Kamas, they've got rebreathers, they slip into the water and they attach limpet mine to the main propeller shaft, and using a rope fixed length they work out where to place the other bomb, which is the engine room. And it's pretty obvious that the bombs, the limpet mines, are designed to not just to sink the ship but also to cripple it. The two of them then go back to the inflatable and they're taken back ashore. Now it just so happens that where they go ashore is being watched by the local boat club neighbourhood watch team, who are getting a bit fed up with boat thieves. So they see this strange boat come ashore, somebody dumps the engine in the water, they're wearing wetsuits, and they're met by a couple with a camper van. And this neighbourhood watch team thinks, aha, boat thieves. And they jot down the particulars, and most importantly, they take the registration number of the van. And this is then passed on to the local police. Just before midnight, the first bomb by the engine room goes off and the ship starts to sink. There's not that many people left on board. They realise something strange is going on. Their first thoughts is that something's happened inside the boat, some form of explosion, and they all start to evacuate the ship. Now, Fernando Pereira was the photographer for Greenpeace, and some of the photos I've shown so far were taken by him. He's got a lot of very expensive equipment, so he goes down below into his cabin to retrieve his cameras at the time roundabout where the second bomb goes off. Now, his cabin is in the stern of the boat, where I'm hoping the arrow is showing you, and the second bomb is down there on the propeller shaft. Now, it's thought that the explosion probably knocked him out, or knocked the wind out of him, or whatever, and there is one tale that the door to the cabin got jammed. Of course, the ship's sinking, the cabin fills with water. Tragically, he is drowned. All the others know is that there is Fernando, and no one's really quite sure what's happened. So this Rainbow Warrior is now lying on the bottom of the quay in Auckland. The aftermath then of the sinking is about 2 hours after the explosion. The New Zealand Navy's operational diving team are called in, and they then go and search the wreck. They discover Pereira's body, and it's pretty obvious what they can see, that the explosion came from outside, and they then search the hull and the wharf for any other explosives, but none are found. And as a result of their findings, the wreck is then declared a crime scene. Meanwhile, Dile, Kister and Kamas have taken the ferry from North Island to South Island in a camper van, and they then pose as tourists. Kister and Kamas go off to a ski resort and spend some time skiing, and Dile goes south. I think it's down to Queenstown or somewhere like that. The Priya and Marfat, the reconnaissance team, the next day go to return their camper van. But by this time, of course, the New Zealand police have been tipped off about these boat thieves, and people are starting to put two and two together. And by a ruse, the Priya and Martha are kept waiting, and eventually the New Zealand police turn up and then take them away and interview them. In the meantime, the boat's been found on the side of the harbour, and where someone heard a splash, the divers recover the Yamaha motor that was used for the boat. So subsequently, the Priya and Martha are eventually charged initially with murder. That gets changed to manslaughter due to the political hoo-ha that's kicked up between New Zealand and France, and to pour some oil onto some troubled waters. A bit of a deal is done there, and they're quite happy to plead guilty to manslaughter, and they're sent to prison for 10 years. In the meantime, the Uvea, which sailed from New Zealand on July the 9th, 11th or something like that, has reached the Australian island Norfolk Island. The antics of the crew of the island had averted the suspicions of the customs officer up in the north, and he tipped off the police and said, look, no, there's been this French yacht that's been behaving a bit strangely. The Australian authorities had tipped off, and the New Zealand, and they're held for the New Zealand police who arrive, search the yacht, take samples from the bilges, and send them off to be tested for explosives, and the crew is interviewed. Interestingly, they find a map from the camper van hire place, and that has the fingers of Marfat, and that gives a lie to Priya and Marfat's statement that they knew nothing at all about this yachting. However, under Australian law, they don't have enough to hold the Uvea, and she sets sail. And later, their forensic samples come back and prove to be positive for explosives. The Uvea never actually makes it to New Caledonia. On the way back to New Caledonia, the Uvea rendezvous with the French nuclear submarine Rubis. The crew are taken off, and then the yacht is scuttled, and the crew basically disappears. So they do turn up in Paris at some later time. Delay, who's having his holiday in New Zealand, leaves for Australia, and then Kister and Camas, the two divers who placed the bombs, then leave for Tahiti on July the 26th. So no one suspects them. They escape. Meanwhile, the Rainbow Warrior is sunk in the dock. There's a picture of it, and a salvage operation then takes place, and more forensics are needed. You can see there that the masts of the ship are removed. The team finds that the hole in the Rainbow Warrior is about 8 feet by 6 feet. The seabed materials and stuff from inside the boss is taken out and sieved over. The divers reported that not only was the engine room wrecked, most of the explosion had basically sent a storm of shrapnel through the lower part of the ship. And you can see there the boats there, the engine is taken out, and about 30 tons of heavy machinery and weight is removed. You can see there the New Zealand Navy dive team, who are the main salvage group, and there you can see the hole that was blown in the side of the Rainbow Warrior, and you can see how obvious it was an external explosion. It's pretty obvious that the ship is beyond repair, because not only has it been saltwater damage from being wrecked, the damage caused by the explosions. And going back to my earlier comments, it's the original refit done by Greenpeace was a bit ham-fisted, shall we say. The salvage people reported that the bulkheads had been compromised. Greenpeace had put various electrical cables and other cabling through the bulkheads and hadn't sealed them and so on, which may have contributed to it sinking so quickly. But essentially, the ship's a write-off and is beyond repair. So the ship is patched and well, initially it's floated and then taken to a dry dock where you can see the forensic examination takes place, and you can see that the hull is eventually patched and the ship is refloated towards the end of September. And then the debate starts, well, what are we going to do with the Rainbow Warrior now that it can't be salvaged? So this brings us now to the second sinking. The New Zealand Underwater Association suggests that the ship sunk for diving, and this idea is taken up and becomes expanded for the Rainbow Warrior to become a memorial and an artificial reef. After much debate and fundraising, it's decided that the ship will be sunk in the Cavalli Islands to the north of Auckland, and there's much fundraising goes on, and you can see here the site of the wreck. This is Matauri Bay, and this beach will be significant in a minute. On the top of this headland is the memorial to the Rainbow Warrior, which was constructed later, and the arrow there is pointing to the approximate position of the wreck. And if you look on the chart there, you can see Matauri Bay, you can see the headland, and then you can see site number 8 there is the wreck site of the Rainbow Warrior. So diving the Rainbow Warrior sunk. The information that I found said that they opened the seacocks and sank the ship, which is probably why it went down the way that it did. I think we're used to some very slick operations with carefully placed explosives, but I think it's just a question of opening up the seacocks, and the ship then was duly sunk after a Maori ceremony. And there you can see ship going down into the sea. So diving the wreck then, again, close up here, you can just make out, I think, the memorial on top of the hill there. This is Matauri Bay, and here is the launch site for the inflatable, and the dive is just around the corner here. I dive with Pahia Dive, who keep a boat there. It's about a 40-minute drive in a minibus. The boat is launched, as you can see on the tractor. And as divers, we all load up all our kit and wait for the boat and so on. And sometimes the surf can be quite exciting or challenging, as they say. The dive site then, this is the downloaded dive profile that I took. And you can see on there that the maximum depth is about 26 meters. And I've put the cursor on the sort of top of the wreck, which is about 18 meters. And this was a typical tourist dive. We'll go down as a group, and it's follow my leader. So the depth to the seabed makes it, quite accessible to most divers. This is what you see when you approach the wreck. This can vary. Site, you just go down the shot line that's placed nearby and then swim towards the wreck. The day that I dived it, the Viz site, and you can see in the distance there the sort of ghostly shadow. Now the position of the wreck is quite interesting because it's lies east to west, with the stern in the east and the bows in the west, and it lies slightly on its starboard side. And over the intervening 35 years, it's now settled into the seabed, and the site of the explosion on the starboard side, which has been patched up, is now buried and can't be seen. The orientation of the wreck means that the starboard side faces south and is therefore shaded from the sun. Don't forget, this is the southern hemisphere. And the port side is now facing north, tilting slightly upwards, and is well lit. And this affects the marine life distribution, as we'll see, with mainly encrusting animal life on the starboard side in the shade, and a lot more algae to port. The wreck site is not subjected to much current flow, which has an effect on the species found there, but it is occasionally subjected to storm damage. Here we can see, approaching the stern of the Rainbow Warrior, you can start to see that there's a patchwork of life there on the to one side from the ship. You can start seeing some of the stuff that's come off in the intervening years due to storm damage. And getting up close now, we can see here, and I've put these little pictures in with a red arrow to show where the picture was taken. This is the position of the rudder, and as you can see, there's quite a patchwork there of encrusting animals. And those of you who are thinking, gosh, that looks like jewel anemones, like what you see in UK waters. Well, they are indeed the New Zealand version of jewel anemones. And this is the propeller shaft. Where the propeller is, I'll come to later. And you can see the propeller shaft there is covered in all sorts of fluffy stuff, which I'm sure Keith will tell us are probably hydrozoans or possibly bryozoans. And that is a feature of the sort of deeper shaded parts of the wreck. If we go along, just a little way along, you can see this patchwork of New Zealand jewel anemones, and as we know, they reproduce effectively making clones of themselves. So you get these multicolored patches. So you'll get a purple patch, an orange patch, a brown patch, a yellow patch, and so on. And this is repeated all the way along that side of the hull. Close up of a patch of the hull. And again, if you're thinking, gosh, those sea anemones look just like the actinothoe that we find on the wrecks around the southwest. Well, indeed, this is the New Zealand cousin of the actinothoe. And throughout the 3 dives that I did, I was quite struck by the similarity of the underwater terrain. You know, everything looked like something I'd seen back home. And when I followed it up later, yes, it's the New Zealand cousin. So you've got very similar pattern. Now, some record has been kept of the colonization pattern, and I showed Keith the 2 reports that I managed to get hold of. They're more anecdotal than they are sort of scientific, and Keith said that the pattern of settlement over time is pretty similar to what happened on the Scylla. What's interesting, though, is the fact that there are some differences that we find. Just go back again. There are certain types of creatures that you would expect to find. One of the things that you don't find on this wreck are large shoals of schooling fish, although the reefs nearby are absolutely teeming with these schools. And it's thought that the lack of currents doesn't bring enough nutrients to make it worth their while to hang around. But you've just got to go on the reefs a few hundred meters away, and they're absolutely teeming with fish. The other thing you don't find on this wreck are sea urchins. It's thought that this might be due to depth. No one's quite sure, but again, they are very common on the reefs nearby. And you also don't get the encrusting algae, you know, those sort of pink, painty type splodges that you get on rocks and wrecks in Britain. And no one's quite sure why they're not there, even on well-lit surfaces. The local fishermen did try and seed the wreck with crawfish, but they didn't hang around, and you don't find them on there, and it's thought again this is probably due to lack of food rather than anybody taking them for food. If we go on, you can see that the corrosion is taking place. I don't think this is an explosion hole because they didn't use explosives on it. So this is just an example of deterioration on the hull that you can see. Moving further along the hull towards the bow, you can see this pattern of sponges and anemones is repeated. And eventually we start coming up towards the bow of Rainbow Warrior, and the bow had this bowsprit fitted, which was used for the stays for the foremast. And you're starting to see here on the starboard side, it's a bit more well lit, but you're starting to see algae starting to make their appearance. Going up onto the top of the ship, if you look inside the forecastle, you can see that it looks fairly bare and empty. And again, the environment in there is a bit like a dead-end cave, very little nutrients getting in there. There's no flow of water through there, so the suspended stuff doesn't get in there, and all the stuff that you'd expect to find isn't seen. And there are several places like that inside the deck. Moving on to the upper deck, you start to see here the starboard bridge wing. And I put this photo in there because you can see where the bridge wing is, but you can see that all this top hamper, which is the steering house or wheelhouse or whatever it is, all that has gone. And it's thought that this was due to the fact that it's largely aluminium, and this corroded and very soon got whipped off in a storm. Moving across the deck, you can see there it's covered in the New Zealand kelp, is it Ecolonia, I think it's called, Ecolonia. And again, there's echoes there of British waters. Moving on inside the wreck, you can see that the remaining superstructure, there's lots of corrosion and there's lots of storm damage in there. You can look through the floor of the deck there into the empty engine space, and the fish that are in there are known, a lot of New Zealand fish have got very strange names. They're called slender roughies or big eyes, and these live in the wreck in the dark during the daytime, and at night they venture out in shoals and start feeding on the plankton in the water. Again, you can see the corrosion that's taking place and the abundance of fish life inside the wreck. This is the galley, and the large item that you can see here, that is the ship's oven and cooker range. Again, more roughies and big eyes. Moving along to the walkways, which were covered in on both sides, you can see again more signs of damage and corrosion. This was my friend on the dive with the GoPro with the incredibly bright video lights, chasing a yellow moray eel, which eventually came over to where I was. But again, you can see the corrosion in the hull there, and it took refuge in that little spot. Some of the fish life that is found on the wreck, you can see there the slender roughies and big eyes, juvenile snappers, a fish called a pigfish, and the female stands out when compared to the male, a bit like cuckoo wrasse, but not perhaps so obvious. And then you've got these triggerfish known as leather jackets and damselfish. And if you look very carefully here, you can see the scorpion fish tucked in there, hiding at the base the kelp. Swimming towards the stern across the deck, and again you can see the kelp that's there. And going down the starboard side walkway towards the stern, eventually going into the covered area and looking back along the sidewalk towards the bow. See a few encrusting species and the odd little fish hiding away. That's the doorway to the after accommodation. No one goes in there because that leads to the cabin where Fernando Pereira drowned, and it's not accessed out of respect. So dive nearly over, leaving the walkway, and then coming up to the stern rail. And you can see here some leather jackets and the encrusting life. And there's a close-up, which I think shows some magenta dual anemones and what is probably a hydrozoan, but no doubt Keith will tell us otherwise. And you can see there the leather jackets that go around picking off to life. And it's back to the line, the deco, lemonade visibility as ever, and then back up to the surface where Hunky Dive Guide Stuart is ready to help us back into the boat. And as a final shot, I just thought I'd show you the actual memorial to the Rainbow Warrior, which was built on that headland. You can see here all the stones from the area and the propeller of the Rainbow Warrior. And this acts as a memorial to the ship, and of course Fernando Pereira tragically died on that wreck. And so that takes us to the end. And I put that in question marks because one of the things that really stands out for me is that the more I look into and start researching and tracking down some of the references, more there is probably to be told about exactly what the French did and so on. And it's thought that there are 2 other teams involved who actually arranged for the team to disappear once they got back into French territory and ultimately back into France. So that ends for now. Thank you.